Our second reading is from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 22, verses 34 to 46. When the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together, and one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question to test him. And he said to Jesus, "Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest?" And Jesus said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, and with all of your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment. And a second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets." Now, while the Pharisees were gathered together, Jesus asked them this question: "What do you think of the Messiah? Whose son is he?" And they said to Jesus, "The son of David." And Jesus said to them, "How is it then that David by the Spirit calls him Lord, saying, 'The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies under your feet'? If David thus calls him Lord, how can he be his son?" No one was able to give him an answer, nor from that day did anyone dare to ask him any more questions. When asked what the greatest commandment is, Jesus refers directly to the Torah, quoting both Deuteronomy, "Love the Lord your God with all of your heart," and Leviticus, "Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself." Because of this, we know these words would not have surprised the Sadducees, the chief priests, the elders, the scribes, the Pharisees, Jesus' disciples, all who were listening to him, or any of the folks who had heard about this afterwards. In fact, I think this is something that across all of our differences and all of their differences, they would have agreed upon. And I think this is something even us as Christians, no matter our denomination, could agree upon too. When I hear this, I'm immediately drawn to the words, "and the second is like it." And I'm not alone. I notice many biblical commentators have reflected on these words too. And perhaps this also caught your attention. When Jesus says, "and the second is like it," it seems to me that in the second part, he is still continuing to describe the first greatest commandment. I think if he wanted to make a hierarchy here of love your God and then love your neighbor as yourself, he would have directly said, "and the second greatest commandment is," but he doesn't. He says, "and the second is like it," placing the second part, love your neighbor as yourself, alongside next to love your God. At first, this feels like a small detail, but if we are to read Jesus' words this morning with all having equal importance, or as all part of the same, of that first greatest commandment, then this commandment is love your God and love your neighbor as yourself. Meaning loving your God with all of your heart is not on its own a separate commandment from loving your neighbor as yourself. Meaning we cannot do one without the other. This love Jesus is reminding us of and calling our attention to is all interconnected. We cannot love our neighbor without loving ourselves and loving God. We cannot love God without loving ourselves and loving our neighbor. To love God is to love our neighbor. To love God is to love ourselves. To love our neighbor is to love God. And to love ourselves is to love God. And Jesus says to do this with all of our heart, with all of our soul, and with all of our mind. When we love with a heart, we are loving with our physical bodies. When we love with our souls, we are loving with our spiritual selves. And when we love with our minds, we are loving with our intellectual being. Jesus is calling us to a love that requires every part of us. To see this all as part of one commandment is significant. Dr. Jason Edwards, a senior pastor of Second Baptist Church in Missouri, said in his blog, "It means that love of God, love of neighbor, and love of self are all intertwined parts of the same whole. It means that the committed Christian must live a life that is upwardly, inwardly, and outwardly directed. It means that we cannot claim that we love God and yet hate our siblings. And I would add, we cannot claim that we love God and yet hate our earth or any of God's creation. Upwardly, inwardly, outwardly, I love this image. Living a life that is upward, reaching to the stars, to the moon, to the God who cares and loves us just as we are. Living a life that is inward, caring for our whole self, every part, even the parts we do not like. And living a life that is outward, reaching out to our neighbors, holding each other in joy and in pain. This is the love I believe Jesus is calling us to. A love that is expansive, that is ever growing in all directions, and a love that is whole. A love that we can always return to. A love that will be there to greet us over and over again with wide open arms. In a few chapters from now, we will witness Jesus returning to God's love through prayer, when he is consumed with pain and fear. After the Last Supper, Jesus takes Peter, James, and John into the garden to pray. He turns to the three of them and says, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death." Then he walks a little further into the garden, and 3 times he prays to God, "Abba, Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will." In this chapter, we witness Jesus returning to God's love for strength and for comfort. We also see Jesus' humanity in this moment. We may not know exactly what this was like for him, but as humans, we can imagine and understand the feelings of fear and sorrow he was experiencing. Jesus trusted God so much to be fully vulnerable. He did not pretend like he was not afraid of what was going to happen. He did not pretend like he was not afraid of dying. He shared his heart with God, and we can too. And I think we need to share our hearts. Yes, we can give thanks to God, we can ask God for comfort, but we can also just tell God how it is. Being truthful, being vulnerable, sharing our tears, our anger, our frustrations, sharing our joys, our celebrations, knowing that God will hold us and will share all of this with us. I believe that it is through being vulnerable with God that God can open and expand our hearts so that we too can receive love and give love abundantly. And as God loves us, we shall love God. And we shall also love ourselves with all of our heart, with all of our soul, and with all of our mind. One of the brothers, Brother Luke from St. John the Evangelist monastery here in Cambridge, once said, "Stop and recover some of your humanity and be found by God." Recover some of your humanity. I think this is so important for us to do because I believe that is through recovering our humanity, all the parts that make us smile or cry, laugh, shout, that we can love God, we can love ourselves, and we can be loved more deeply. That we can find and be found by God. We are not robots. We are not machines. We have the ability to feel, to connect, to love. That is what makes us human. To love ourselves is to hold on to what makes us human. To love ourselves is to let ourselves just be. To love ourselves is to let ourselves cry. We cannot cry too much during these times. Friends, I will admit there are days when I'll go for a walk and I can just feel my eyes filling up. Don't tell yourself to stop being silly or to be stronger. And for the love of God, Yes, for the love of God, do not apologize. Let yourself just be. Because love is also gentle and kind. Gently dab the water streaming down your cheeks, because these tears are what reminds us that we're human, that we are alive, that there is love in us and pouring out of us. And to love ourselves is to laugh with one another, to laugh with God. I recall reading this book, Gay Souls, in my first year of divinity school. And I also shared this in the Dancing with God, Faith and Life group. This book is a collection of interviews with gay men centered on their beliefs of the soul and what they believe their souls to be. In one particular interview with James Broughton, he talks about his friend, Alan Watts. Every morning, Alan would go out on his porch, hold on to his ribs, and laugh with God until his whole body shook. Love can tickle us. It can make our whole bodies shake. It can flow through us like the air we breathe, filling our lungs. To love ourselves is to take that air and shout. Shout from a mountaintop, scream into a pillow. You know, when I think about shouting, I'm reminded when Jesus in Luke says, "I've come to bring fire on the earth, and how I wish you had already kindled." Love is releasing all that is on your mind, setting all of your burdens and worries on fire, setting all those voices that tell you you are not enough, you need to do better, on fire, until they are mere smoke, dissipating into thin air. And as we love God, as we love ourselves, we too shall love our neighbors with all of our heart, with all of our soul, and with all of our mind. You know, to love our neighbor sometimes feels simple, right? I'm like, okay, Jesus, that totally feels doable. Until someone cuts me off in traffic and beeps at me like it was my fault that they cut me off. Feels doable until I'm on hold with an insurance company for hours, and then they hang up. And I have to start the process all over again. And boy, it is really, really hard to love the next neighbor who picks up that phone to help me. Out of all seriousness, though, when it comes to love, it is not always smiles and rainbows. To love is to also experience rage. Rage is different from hate. Lexi talked about this a few weeks ago in her sermon, quoting Reverend Heidi Heath. I found this incredibly powerful. Reverend Heidi says, "Rage is holy, but hate is destructive." Rage can be sacred. It allows us to heal the world and be fueled for the revolution. We witness Jesus releasing rage throughout our scriptures, even flipping tables in the temple. To love is to yell from the streets, "Black Lives Matter." It is to say the names of all those who are killed because of the complexion of their skin, because of their gender identity and expression. It is to cry out, enough is too much. No one should go hungry. No one should go without health care. No one should be caged behind bars. It is to release all this rage until we feel our hearts pounding, beating out of our chests, until our hearts break wide open. That is love. To love our neighbor is to be still. It's to be present. It's to listen. To listen to what is said, to what is not said. Someone very wise once told me that things are easier to carry when they are shared. To love our neighbor is to share those things that weigh down our hearts, that make us feel like we are unable to move. To love our neighbor is to love ourselves. And to love our neighbor and ourselves is to love our God. I would like to close today with lyrics from the Banksons' The Keep On Going song. This song has been bringing me so much life this week. And I pray that when we meet again, that the world has changed into the world that we are imagining now together. And I pray that the world has become the world we are planting inside of ourselves for each other and for our ancestors and for our kids. I pray that you will feel a little bit less alone, and we will feel a little bit less alone in the work and in the hurt, and we will be together somehow. Siblings, I pray that as we love God, as we love ourselves, as we love our neighbors with all of our hearts, our souls, our minds, as much as we possibly can, that our world changes as a result in all the ways we so desperately need right now. I pray that this love Jesus is calling us to and directing our attention towards will renew us and will sustain us. I pray that this love will help us all feel a little bit less alone in the days ahead, in the months ahead. I pray that this love will comfort us, will embolden us. I pray that this love floods through us in tears, in rage, in laughter, in joy, in smiles, reminding us that we are alive and that we are also loved by God more than we can possibly ever imagine.